In your book, The Harm in Hate Speech, you argue that hate speech should actually be regulated. Why?
Well, it should be regulated for a couple of reasons. First, we should be concerned about the prospect of intercommunal violence, of hatred between different groups being stirred up, exaggerated, exploited by various speakers. We want to make sure that we develop some sort of peace or harmony in society, particularly among religious groups at the moment. And secondly, we are worried, or we ought to be worried, by the prospect that hate speech aims to make members of vulnerable minorities feel excluded. It sort of undermines their basic social standing, or it tries to convey a message to them that they are to be treated as less than human or less than citizens. And that's kind of an insult to them, and it's actually a real harm. Not maybe a physical harm, although it intimates the possibility of physical harm, intimates the possibility of discrimination, but it undermines the basis on which they go about their business and raise their families in ordinary life.
But Professor, you already know what my next question is going to be. Wouldn't hate speech laws violate our most closely held belief in freedom of speech?
It would certainly require us to rethink that closely held belief, and I think the United States has a very strong commitment to the First Amendment, and that's a very valuable thing in all sorts of areas, not just hate speech. We do restrict speech in various areas. You can't engage in threatening speech. You can't engage in subversive subversion or incitement or certain forms of libel or defamation. You can't distribute child pornography. There are all sorts of speech acts that we do regulate. But you're absolutely right. This would require us to think very carefully about balancing the very strong value that we have for free speech with the good that we were trying to do with these regulations. I will say that most other democracies who also believe in free speech have drawn this balance somewhat differently from the way that we have.
But Professor, I feel like I'm on that slippery slope. How do you determine what's hate speech and what's not? And then obviously part B to the question, who would actually get to decide?
Yeah, it's a hugely important question, and the sense of a slippery slope is absolutely accurate. This is an area where great care is needed, as it's needed with every restriction on speech that we already have. So you need to have, first of all, a very well-drafted statute, making it clear that you're dealing with particular abusive and threatening and insulting language that aims to stir up hatred between different racial groups or different ethnic or religious groups. So the first thing you do is pay attention to the drafting of the legislation. And then secondly, you have to have sensible people to administer it. And in many countries, like Great Britain, for example, no prosecutions can be brought under this without the consent of the Attorney General, so that you have some control from the executive side on this. And thirdly, you need to have judges who understand what we're trying to do and what we're not trying to do with these statutes. The final thing I'd say, Dominic, is that you really need to make sure that there are various exceptions and safe havens whereby people can say what they want to say, only not necessarily in a public context that is abusive or insulting. So with those four elements, your safe havens, your discretion, and your legislative drafting and attention by the judges to the point of the legislation, that's where your safeguards come in.
Perhaps the million-dollar question tonight, Professor, do you feel that hate speech laws would have prevented the anti-Muslim video that's allegedly the cause of the violence throughout the Middle East from being made and distributed?
It's really hard to answer that question. For one thing, there's an enormous practical difficulty, as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said yesterday, in actually preventing the dissemination of this material, even if we were legally entitled to do so. But secondly, it's interesting. The hate speech laws that you have, for example, in Great Britain, make this a very, very close case, because although it prohibits stirring up hatred against a group of religious worshippers, say followers of Islam, it specifically exempts attacks on the religion itself or attacks on the founder of the religion. It draws that distinction between attacks on the believers and attacks on the beliefs. And from what I saw of that video, I watched most of it this morning, it is mostly an attack on the founder of the religion, an attack on the religion itself, although near the beginning of the video, the thing is framed as an attack on Muslims themselves.
I'm running out of time, but I have two quick questions I'd like to try and get to. One, what sort of punishment, in your judgment, Professor, does the alleged filmmaker deserve?
Well, in a system where there was hate speech regulation and where it was judged that this had fallen foul of that regulation, the punishment would be a fine or perhaps a short period of imprisonment. Certainly people have been sent to prison for 6 months, that sort of thing in Britain, for publishing attacks on other racial groups or attacks on Muslims.
You already know this final question, Professor. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes once said that free speech would not protect a man falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. Is that principle still adhered to in the U.S.? And if so, is the anti-Muslim video an example of shouting fire in a crowded theater?
That principle still seems to hold as good law, though remember, it's not really an articulated principle. It's a metaphor or an example, and we have to extrapolate from the situation of shouting fire in a crowded theatre to shouting anti-Muhammad slogans through a video and broadcasting it around the world. Everything depends on how you do that analogy or how you do that extrapolation. But I think a reasonable case could be made. Those who made this video intended to cause a panic, in my view, or they did so with what we might call in the law depraved indifference as to whether a panic would result or not. So it's certainly in the ballpark, I think, for the application of that principle.